Tax avoidance will cost the world a total of $5 trillion over the next decade. That's the conclusion of a new report by the Tax Justice Network, a campaign group calling for global tax reform. According to its research, the use of tax havens by multinationals and wealthy individuals deprive countries of $472 billion in tax revenue every year. Now, to put that into perspective, that is more than the entire world spends on public health annually. To talk more about this, we can bring in Alex Cobham, Chief Executive at the Tax Justice Network, which authored that report. Hi, Alex. Good to have you with us. Just to be clear, we are talking about legal tax avoidance here, aren't we?
Well, it's a combination. So because of the way that the tax rules work, or rather the way that they don't work, it's actually impossible to draw a hard line between what's illegal or unlawful avoidance and what's lawful. So what we can see in the data is simply the scale of profit shifting, the amount of profits of multinational companies that they're declaring in low tax or no tax jurisdictions instead of in the places where they're actually making that money, where they carry out their real activity. We can't say for sure in every case that they're breaking the law to do that. We certainly can't say that they're not breaking the law. What we can say is that the impact is, as you've just laid out, these huge losses of tax revenue that cost all of us in terms of foregone public services, in terms of our small businesses not being able to compete, not having a level playing field because they are paying their taxes, and because of the inequality that we all suffer as a result of not having these progressive taxes and public services in place.
OK, but how would a progressive tax actually look? What are you proposing as a reform?
So what we need, and what the G20 group of countries actually agreed 10 years ago, but the OECD has completely failed to deliver, is simply that companies should pay taxes, multinational companies, the same as domestic companies, should pay taxes in the same place that they make their money. So where they have their staff, where they make their sales. Now, there is a simple method of tax, unitary taxation, that we could easily move to that requires that. We assess the tax due on the multinational at the global level, and we apportion that between the countries where they have their real activity. Instead, we're stuck with a set of tax rules that the League of Nations agreed 100 years ago, and the OECD has tried to defend ever since, that rely on this pretense that the individual companies within a multinational group are actually trading with each other as if they were at arm's length, as if they were independent companies. Now, that's a complete myth. It's not true, and it's wide open to abuse. That's why we get these hundreds of billions of dollars in tax losses. So we need to shift to this system that allows us to tax companies in the places they're actually making money and really cuts through this profit shifting. But the OECD has failed to deliver that. And that's why there is now this push to move forward with negotiations at the United Nations, where there's just a much greater chance of having the kind of transparent and accountable negotiations that will allow us to get to a place where everyone is taxed relatively fairly.
I do want to ask you about how, though, because the OECD did come to an agreement in 2021 on a minimum 15% tax rate for multinationals. First of all, don't they deserve some credit for that? And if you want to move this to the UN, why would tax reform succeed there where it has failed with the OECD?
These are very good questions. The first one, actually, that's wrong. The OECD didn't get an agreement in 2021, except in principle. There was then, and continues now, to be no legally binding commitment. In fact, the OECD proposal has two pillars. The first is Pillar 1, that's about dealing with some of the tax abuse of digital companies. What they've now put forward will not be ratified, will not come into force for anyone unless the United States signs up. And the United States, it's now clear, will not sign up. The US Congress is opposed. So that means Pillar 1 has gone for all intents and purposes, unless there's a dramatic shift in the US. So the world is waiting on one country and can't move forward. Pillar 2, which is the minimum tax that you've talked about, some countries and jurisdictions have begun to introduce a piece of that. But actually, it's the most aggressive corporate tax havens that are moving ahead, like Switzerland, like the Cayman Islands. And that's because they've worked out that this is such a badly designed tax, they can actually do better under it. Meanwhile, the degree of profit shifting will continue as before, even if other countries sign up, which looks increasingly unlikely. So we've had 10 years, really, since 2013, of the OECD having the responsibility to deliver this and failing to do so. There may be a legally binding instrument in place, possibly by the end of this year, but it's unlikely it will have any significant effect on revenue losses at all. That's why last year, all of the countries of the world agreed in a unanimous consensus that's almost unprecedented in this area to move forward at the United Nations with intergovernmental discussions on a new framework for international tax cooperation. As you say, it's not clear that we can get agreement at the UN when it's been difficult at the OECD. But here's the difference. The United Nations has been designed to allow countries with conflicting interests on very complex questions to negotiate together. And because those negotiations are transparent, people like us can hold our governments to account for the positions they're taking. The problem at the OECD is they're really not designed for this type of negotiation, and all of the process is done in secret. And that means you have governments coming out saying, oh, we are firmly against corporate tax abuse. And meanwhile, we can hear privately that in practice what they're saying is, no, we don't want to make any progress at all, let's block this. So the UN doesn't guarantee you'll make progress, but it creates the possibility. Keeping things at the OECD pretty much guarantees that we will continue not to make progress. And that means not just not making progress internationally, but having this kind of zombie process continuing to go along, preventing countries from taking unilateral measures that would be more effective themselves.
So if I'm understanding you right, the UN, in your view, promises more transparency, but certainly no more hope of consensus.
Well, the thing is, we've seen at the UN, if you think about something like the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there are cases where a big blocker, for example, the United States, has been publicly shamed into having to take a better position. Because the negotiations are conducted in public, both the individual countries of the world can see each other and see what they're doing, but so also can the citizens. So when a country is taking a blocking position against measures that would be good for everyone, including itself, and perhaps it's doing that because of the corporate lobbying that it's subject to, and that's something we see in tax just as much as we see it in climate work, that country can be forced by the transparency into taking a better position. That's certainly what happened with the United States on climate. And the expectation is that while at the minute the tax negotiations at the OECD allow individual countries to play a very significant blocking role without any kind of accountability, in the United Nations that's simply not possible. Now, that doesn't guarantee that every country will behave better, that we won't have blockers, but it does guarantee that you'll be able to see what's happening. And the other big difference, whereas the OECD tries to achieve consensus privately, the UN has an explicit mechanism for voting. So you can see eventually that on questions where you can't reach consensus, you move forward with a majority. And that means an individual country, even a very big one like the United States, cannot block the rest of the world from moving forward if it's clearly in their interests.
I want to look at the potential effect of tax reform now, because many countries, including Ireland, have built their economies around attracting multinationals with low corporation tax rates. Wouldn't a reform of this kind put many ordinary workers at risk of losing their jobs?
I'd say it's almost the opposite. It's true Ireland has sort of played the tax haven game better than some, in that they've given away these tax breaks, made it very attractive for profit shifting into Ireland in exchange for creating some employment within Ireland. But they've done that at the expense of imposing huge tax revenue losses on other EU countries. So it's the most kind of anti-social behaviour to neighbours that you can imagine. And in practice, Ireland gets some money out of that and some employment, but it's much less than what is lost by the European Union as a bloc. So if you can get to a position where everyone is effectively taxing only the real activity in their country. That creates the possibility for each country to look not to play this game against each other, where you're getting really very low value jobs as a payoff for imposing tax abuse on other countries, but actually every country is generating the employment that's to do with productive economic activity. And the other thing for Ireland is that at the minute, it's very, very difficult for small and medium-sized domestic businesses to compete with these multinationals that have such huge tax breaks to encourage them to do their profit shifting through Ireland. And of course, it's the small and medium-sized businesses in most countries that generate the bulk of the employment and also the bulk of the economic growth, because they're also the more innovative companies and so on. So what Ireland's model does is it actually suppresses the most creative, productive, employment-generating parts of the economy in order to cater to the whims of multinationals who are choosing to not pay their taxes in other countries. So ultimately, it's not just antisocial towards Ireland's neighbours, it's also damaging to Ireland's own economy. There will be an adjustment process, because Ireland is so embedded in that approach. To unravel it quickly would be costly. But I think that's what you need, an Irish government that's foresighted enough to say, we can see this coming and we need to start moving the economy back towards a more productive basis and away from this damaging behaviour that imposes such high cost on other countries.
All right, Alex Cobham, Chief Executive at the Tax Justice Network. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate.